Whose child is this? Lord Hargreaves' voice carried across the entrance hall of Ashwick Park, with the particular precision of a man accustomed to being heard in rooms that had not invited his opinion. He had arrived 30 minutes before the other guests, which was characteristic. He stood now in the centre of the black and white marble floor, his walking stick planted like a surveyor's pole, and he addressed his question to the wall above the staircase, where a small figure in a white pinafore had just appeared at the balustrade. The figure belonged to a boy of perhaps 2 years, who was currently attempting to push an ivory chess piece through the carved railing and watching it with great scientific interest. Whose child is this? Lord Hargreave asked again, and this time there was sufficient edge in the words that 2 footmen glanced toward the upper corridor and a housemaid froze in the act of arranging the last chrysanthemums in the entrance hall's central vase. Rosalind Vane heard the question from the morning room, where she was reviewing the evening's seating arrangement against the guest list the Duke's secretary had sent down that morning. She set the list on the writing table with a deliberate motion. She pressed one hand briefly against the edge of the table, then she walked into the entrance hall. She was wearing the grey wool dress. She had worn it 3 times in the previous fortnight, and she was aware of this, and she wore it anyway, because it was the most practical thing she owned, and there was a great deal of practical work to be done before 22 guests arrived for the Duke of Ashwick's autumn dinner. She did not hurry. She walked at the pace of someone who has managed crises before breakfast for years and has learned that urgency is a mask that makes everything harder to see. She stopped at the foot of the staircase and looked up. "Come down, Thomas," she said. The boy at the balustrade looked at her with the particular measuring expression of a child who has assessed the relative seriousness of various adults and placed them in their correct order. Then he pushed the chess piece through the railing. It fell and bounced twice on the marble, and he turned toward the upper corridor to find the stairs. Lord Hargreave turned to look at Rosalind. He was a heavy-set man of 63, with the kind of jaw that had been authoritative in youth and had since expanded into something that simply occupied more territory. He looked at her the way a man looks at a piece of furniture that has unexpectedly moved. "You are," he began. "Miss Vane," she said. "I have been managing the household at Ashwick Park for the past 8 months." She said it without inflection, which was the only way she knew how to say things that required emphasis. Thomas reached the bottom of the stairs and pressed himself briefly against Rosalind's leg. She did not look down at him immediately. She was still watching Lord Hargreave, who was assembling his next sentence. "The child belongs to the household," he said, and the word belonged carried a specific coloration, as if he were asking about a piece of unclaimed luggage. "Thomas is the Duke's ward," she said. "He has been in residence at Ashwick Park since July." Lord Hargreave looked at the boy, then at Rosalind, then at the space between them, with an expression that was doing considerable arithmetic. He opened his mouth. Behind him, the main doors opened. The Duke of Ashwick entered the way he entered every room, without announcement, without particular speed, and with the absolute absence of any desire to be watched. He wore a black tailcoat, with a single button undone at the lowest point of the waist, which had been that way, Rosalind had noted, since he had crossed the East Garden an hour ago. He carried nothing. He looked at Lord Hargreave with the flat attention of a man completing an obligation, and then his gaze moved to Rosalind, and then to Thomas, and something in his face shifted, not visibly, not in any way that Lord Hargreave would have caught, but Rosalind, who had spent 8 months observing Marcus Vellantry, the 7th Duke of Ashwick, had learned to read the small adjustments. He had seen the chess piece on the floor. He had seen Thomas against her leg. He had made a complete assessment of the situation in approximately 4 seconds. "Hargreave," he said, "you are early." "I am punctual," Lord Hargreave said. "The party is late." "The party," said the Duke, "does not arrive for 50 minutes. He looked at Thomas. "Have you been throwing things off the landing again?" Thomas considered this question with the same serious weight he had applied to the chess piece's trajectory. Yes, he said. We will discuss the physics of that later, the Duke said. He looked at Rosalind. The look lasted approximately 2 seconds. It contained nothing that could have been called an expression. And then he moved toward the drawing room, and Lord Hargreave fell in beside him, and the entrance hall resumed its ordered preparation for 22 people who did not yet know what kind of evening awaited them. Rosalind picked up the chess piece from the floor. She handed it to Thomas. She returned to the morning room and picked up the seating arrangement. The button on the Duke's tailcoat had been undone since morning. It had been undone, she estimated, for 4 hours. She had not mentioned it. She picked up the list, located the error in the 3rd row. Lord Hargreave had been placed directly beside his estranged brother-in-law, which the Duke's secretary clearly had not known, and she revised it in her neat small hand, and she went to find the head footman to rearrange 3 places before anyone arrived. She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like rescue. She had learned to arrange the chairs herself. Rosalind had come to Ashwick Park in March, which was the wrong month for arriving anywhere in the north of England, because the roads were still half frozen, and the light lasted only until 4 in the afternoon, and everything had the quality of an illustration from a book about endurance. She had come from her cousin Helena's house in York, where she had spent 4 years managing an estate of 800 acres, 2 tenant farms, a wool concern, and a set of accounts that Helena's husband, Mr. Fordwick, had left in comprehensive ruin when he died. She had not been invited to manage those things. She had arrived at Helena's house in 1815, with £17, a letter of introduction that her father had written the previous winter, and that was made obsolete by his death 3 weeks later, and a determination she had not yet named. Helena had a newborn and a grief she could not organise, and Rosalind had looked at the household and at the accounts and at the stack of creditors' letters on the study desk, and she had made a decision that was not dramatic and was not resigned. She had simply decided that she was not going to become less than she was, because the circumstances had narrowed. She had sat down at the desk and opened the first letter. In the 4 years that followed, she had renegotiated Fordwick's wool contracts with 3 separate merchants, recovering £40 annually in margin that had been lost to a clause allowing the merchant to set the grade on delivery. She had identified a discrepancy in the tenant farm accounts, £22 over 3 years, drawn by a steward who had subsequently left the county, and she had documented it and presented it to the solicitor, who had recovered 14 of the £22 and looked at her with an expression she had seen before on men who had just been surprised by a woman, a particular blankness that preceded either acknowledgement or retreat. He had retreated into formal courtesy, which was the more comfortable option for him. She had managed the harvest in 1817, when the head tenant's wife was ill, and the harvest supervisor was inexperienced, and the weather turned against them on the 3rd day. She had arranged alternate storage, recalculated the margin, and written Helena a letter explaining what had happened and what had been done about it, because Helena deserved to understand her own estate. Helena had wept reading the letter, not from distress, but from something Rosalind recognised as the specific exhaustion of having been protected from information for too long. In 4 years, Rosalind had reduced Fordwick's outstanding creditor balance from £312 to 41. She had produced accounts that a solicitor would have been comfortable presenting to an investor. She had done this while managing a household of 8, raising Helena's son James through the first years of his life, and wearing the same 3 dresses in rotation. She had received no wage. She had received room, board, and the understanding that she had somewhere to be, which was not nothing, but was also not enough. When the letter came from the Duke of Ashwick's solicitor in February, she had read it 3 times before she was sure she understood what it was offering: a position, household manager at Ashwick Park, in the capacity of what the letter carefully termed a domestic superintendent. The wage was £60 annually. The letter had been careful about what the position was not. It was not a governess position, not a housekeeper's position in the traditional sense. but something that required, in the solicitor's precise phrasing, a person of education and organizational capacity, familiar with estate accounts and creditor management, capable of independent judgment. She had not known how such a letter had come to be written in her name. She had not, at that point, known that the solicitor was Edward Carew, who had been the Ashwick family's man of business for 22 years, and who had received, 6 weeks earlier, a detailed inquiry from the Duke himself about the management of the Fordwick estate in York, and who had become, in the course of his research, aware that the person actually managing that estate was not its widow, and was not its steward, but was a Miss Rosalind Vane, 29 years of age, unmarried, with no formal credentials, and an account book that was, in Carew's own estimation, the finest piece of estate documentation he had seen in 30 years of practice. She had accepted the position by return post. She had packed the grey wool dress and the brown wool dress and the dark green dress that was beginning to show its age at the cuffs, and she had kissed James on the forehead, and she had held Helena for a long moment in the cold front hall, and then she had gotten into the hired coach, and she had not looked back, not from indifference but from the knowledge that looking back was a form of asking whether you were allowed to go. She arrived at Ashwick Park on the 11th of March and found a household that had been without coherent domestic management for 14 months, since the previous housekeeper had departed following a dispute with the Duke's estate steward that no one would explain to Rosalind's satisfaction. The steward himself, a man named Kessler, had the particular manner of someone who had grown comfortable in a house where no one was paying close attention, and he looked at Rosalind with a specific species of contempt that she recognized as fear, wearing a more socially acceptable face. The Duke was not in residence when she arrived. He arrived 4 days later, on a Tuesday evening, with mud on his boots and a report from the Northern estate under his arm, and he had walked into the study, where Rosalind was reviewing the household accounts by candlelight, and he had looked at her and said, "You are Miss Vane." "Yes, Your Grace," she said. "Carew says you managed the Fordwick estate in York." "I managed its accounts and creditor relationships. Its operations required some reorganization during the harvest of 1817. He had looked at her for a moment, with the measuring attention of someone who had just heard a note played in a register they had not expected. Then he had set the estate report on the corner of the desk and said, "There is a problem with the Eastern Tenant Farms that Kessler has been managing in a way that is going to require documentation. I would appreciate it if you would begin there." That was their first conversation. It had taken 4 minutes. He had not asked her age, her family history, her connections, or her reason for taking the position. He had told her what the problem was, and implied she was capable of addressing it. It was the most direct acknowledgement of her capacity she had received from any person of authority in 4 years, and it arrived in the form of a work assignment, delivered by a man who had already walked back into the corridor before she could respond. She had picked up her list and gone to review the Eastern Tenant Farm accounts the following morning. Marcus Vellantry, the 7th Duke of Ashwick, had inherited his title at 26, which was too young by 8 years to be ready for it, and too old by 10 years to be excused from it. He was 33 now, and he wore the 7 years of the dukedom the way a man wears a coat that was cut for a different version of himself. Not uncomfortably, exactly, but with an awareness of where it did not quite fit. His mother had died the winter before he inherited. She had been a woman of considerable organizing intelligence, in Carew's description, and Marcus had not understood until she was gone what it was that she had actually been doing in the house for 30 years. The household had disclosed itself to him in her absence like a machine that reveals its complexity only when it begins to fail. He had spent the first 2 years of his dukedom learning, at considerable expense, what she had known without apparent effort. He had not replaced her knowledge. He had hired people who had departed and hired others who had been inadequate, and the house had continued its slow revelation of the difference between management and administration. Kessler managed, no one administered. He had not gone looking for Rosalind Vane. He had gone looking for the Fordwick estate accounts, because a colleague at his club had mentioned the wool contracts in the north as a comparison point for his own tenant negotiations, and the name of the Fordwick estate had come up in the course of a letter to Carew, and Carew had written back with the observation, quiet and precise, that the Fordwick estate's recovery was not, in fact, attributable to any formal estate manager on record. Carew's letter had arrived on a Thursday. By the following Tuesday, Marcus had authorised Carew to make the inquiry and had sat in the library of Ashwick Park for an hour, reading the second and third ledger pages Carew had enclosed as evidence of the methodology, not the conclusions, but the working, the margin calculations, the rewritten clause, the documentation of the steward's discrepancy, the harvest reorganisation described in 3 columns of neat handwriting that were precise, without being cold, and organised without being mechanical. He had sat with those pages for an hour. Then he had written to Carew and said, offer her the position, at £60, and make the letter clear about what the work is. He was not certain what he expected. He was certain that the letter had been written by someone who was not going to misunderstand what was being asked. What he had not expected was the particular quality of her stillness. She was not quiet because she was deferential. She was quiet because she was paying attention, and her attention had a density to it, a focused weight, that made the room feel more ordered simply by her presence in it. He noticed this the first evening he arrived in the study, and found her at his desk with the candlelight making a small, ordered circle of the account books around her. He did not say it. He gave her work to do instead, because that was the most honest thing he knew how to offer. In the weeks that followed, he had watched her manage Kessler. She did not confront Kessler directly in the first weeks, which was the correct tactical decision, because a direct confrontation would have made Kessler defensive and uncooperative before she had enough documentation to require his cooperation on her terms. Instead, she asked questions. She asked for records. She asked for the records of records. She built, over 6 weeks, a complete picture of where the Eastern tenant farm accounts had been manipulated. Not fraudulently, exactly, but in a way that had consistently diverted minor revenues into a discretionary fund that Kessler controlled entirely. The total over 3 years was £67. She had presented this to Marcus in the library on a Thursday evening in April, 6 weeks after her arrival. She had laid 4 pages of annotated accounts on the desk between them and said, I am not suggesting deliberate fraud. I am suggesting that the categorization structure permitted Kessler a discretionary margin that he used for his own purposes. This is the documentation. She had paused. There are 2 ways to address it. I can speak to him directly and make the new categorization requirements clear going forward, which will correct the practice without requiring him to leave. Or you can choose the alternative. What would you recommend? Marcus asked. She had considered the question with the same calm weight she applied to everything. He knows the farms, she said. His local knowledge is difficult to replace quickly, but he will test any system I build if he believes he can. I think the direct conversation is necessary, but it should come from your authority, not mine. He will not take the correction from a woman he has decided is his inferior. Marcus had said, I will speak to him tomorrow morning. You will be present. She had looked at him then with a particular expression, not surprise, precisely, but the expression of someone who has presented evidence, expecting to manage the response alone, and has found the response already organised in her favour. It was there for 2 seconds, and then it was gone, and she had gathered the account pages and said, Thank you, Your Grace, and left the library. He had stood in the room for a moment after she left, and noticed, with a kind of internal precision, he did not examine too closely, that the room felt less ordered than it had while she was in it. Thomas had arrived in July, which was not something Marcus had arranged or anticipated. Thomas was the son of his cousin Robert Vellantry, who had died in the spring with no will, no funds, and a wife who had not survived the winter before him. Thomas had arrived at Ashwick Park in the charge of a nurse who departed the following morning, and Marcus had stood in the entrance hall, looking at a 2-year-old child who looked back at him with Robert's exact dark eyes and an expression of scientific curiosity that suggested he was not particularly troubled by his situation. Marcus had looked at Carew, who had accompanied Thomas from London. Carew had looked at Thomas, then at Marcus, with the particular expression of a man who has handled complicated situations for 22 years and is about to handle another one. "He is your ward by default," Carew said. "Robert had no other family. The legalities are straightforward." Marcus had said, "We will need to make arrangements for his care." He had said it to Carew, but he had also said it, he was aware, into the general air of the house, which included Rosalind, who was standing at the far end of the entrance hall, reviewing the linen order, and who looked up at that moment with the kind of quiet assessment that made him feel that the arrangements were already being made. She did not volunteer anything that evening. The following morning she had appeared in the study with Thomas, who was sitting on the floor with a wooden horse, and she had said, "I have spoken to Mrs. Daltrey about the East Nursery. It is suitable with some modification. I can manage the modifications from the household account if you authorise a £7 allocation." A pause. "He has had a difficult spring. He responds well to routine. I will build one." "Yes," Marcus said. That was all. She had built one. Thomas ate at regular hours and slept at regular hours and appeared at the top of the staircase at irregular hours, which was a problem that the routine had not yet addressed. Marcus had found Thomas in the library at 10 o'clock in the evening twice in the first month, sitting on the floor with a book he was holding upside down, waiting in the quiet way of a child who is not sure whether waiting is allowed. Marcus had sat down on the floor beside him both times, which was not something he had planned. They had sat in companionable silence until Rosalind appeared in the library doorway with the nursery lamp and said, "There you are," with the particular calm of someone who was not surprised and was not angry, and Thomas had gone with her without protest, and Marcus had remained on the library floor for an additional minute before returning to his chair. October brought the autumn dinner, and Lord Hargreave and 17 other guests, and Lady Constance Farewell, who arrived on the arm of her mother with the arranged certainty of a woman who has been told by multiple reliable sources that she is the obvious candidate for the next Duchess of Ashwick. Lady Constance was 24, fair-skinned and precise in her beauty, possessed of excellent connections, a considerable portion, and a thorough understanding of what a ducal household required in terms of social management. She wore a gown of ivory silk that had been chosen for this particular occasion, and she moved through the drawing room with the ease of someone who has rehearsed arriving without appearing to have rehearsed. She was not unkind. She was the system made visible, everything the system had been designed to produce, and she was correct by every measure the system recognised. She saw Rosalind, who was directing a footman toward the final arrangement of the drawing room before the guests moved in for dinner, and she assessed her with the quick accuracy of a woman who has been trained to categorise other women by function. The grey wool dress placed Rosalind in her category immediately. "You are the housekeeper," Lady Constance said. "Household superintendent," Rosalind said. "The table for the drawing room will be readied in the next 10 minutes, my lady. The flowers in the entrance hall are slightly underdressed for an autumn dinner," Lady Constance said. Not unkindly. She genuinely meant it as information. "I have the chrysanthemums from the cutting garden in reserve," Rosalind said. "I was holding them until the temperature in the hall settled. The entrance will be warmer now that the guests have arrived. I will add them before dinner is announced." Lady Constance looked at her with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite approval. "Very thorough," she said, and moved into the drawing room. Rosalind added the chrysanthemums. She had planned to add them at precisely this moment for 2 days. She did not find satisfaction in having been correct about the timing. She simply found that it worked, which was the point. The dinner itself required management from outside the room. which was its own form of labour. Rosalind coordinated 12 people from the kitchen to the dining room and back, tracked the pacing of 5 courses against the expected rhythm of the conversation, identified at the second course that Lord Hargreaves' revised seat was not creating the problem she had feared. She stood near the service door at intervals and listened to the dining room through the particular quality of sound that told her whether the room was eating or talking or doing both, because a room that stops eating at the second course has a problem that will arrive at the kitchen in 10 minutes. At the third course, Marcus said something to the room that she did not hear clearly, and the room laughed, and she heard in the quality of that laughter, relaxed, genuine, not performed, that the dinner was proceeding well. She went to confirm the fourth course timing with the cook. She did not return to the dining room until the guests had moved to the drawing room, and she was reviewing the arrangement of the dessert service when she became aware that Marcus was in the doorway of the dining room, which was empty now, watching her with the attention he applied to things he was trying to understand. "The seating revision was correct," he said. "Lord Hargreave and his brother-in-law have not spoken in 6 years," she said. "Placing them at a dinner table together would have produced a conversation the room could not have ignored. How did you know about the estrangement?" Carew mentioned it in passing when I asked him about the guest list. He did not think it was relevant to the seating. Marcus looked at her with the expression she had learned to read as one step beyond his usual containment, a fractional opening, like a door moved by a change in air pressure. "Carew thinks of many things as not relevant to the seating," he said. She returned to the dessert arrangement. "It will all be relevant to something, eventually," she said. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. He remained in the doorway for an additional moment, and then he went back to his guests. The following morning brought a complication Rosalind had not anticipated, which was Lady Hargreaves' observation at the breakfast table, delivered to her neighbour, Mrs. Alderton, in the confident half-whisper of a woman who considers the servants functionally deaf, that it was irregular, to say the least, having the domestic superintendent handling a ward in addition to the household. One must wonder what the arrangement is, exactly. Rosalind, who was supervising the breakfast service from the sideboard, and who was not functionally deaf, did not look up from the coffee arrangement. Mrs. Alderton said, "The child seems well cared for," in the tone of someone offering a very small defence. "Cared for," Lady Hargreaves said, "is not the question." A pause. "What is the question is what the Duke imagines he is doing with a domestic superintendent of no family, managing a ward of the dukedom in a household that clearly requires a lady of suitable standing to manage these things properly." Rosalind set down the coffee urn and turned to address the room. She spoke in her normal register, which was not loud, but was clear. "The ward of the dukedom is 2 years old and responds well to routine. His care is consistent and documented. I am happy to show the schedule to anyone who has a concern about its adequacy." She paused. "More coffee, Lady Hargreave." Lady Hargreave took the coffee. That afternoon, Rosalind was in the morning room, reviewing the winter accounts, when Charlotte Devereux appeared in the doorway. Charlotte was the Duke's cousin twice removed, 26, and had arrived the previous evening with the quality of a person who finds arriving at parties a reasonable way to spend a Thursday. She had the direct eyes of someone who sees what she looks at, and the habit of saying what she thought, without first arranging it to be comfortable. "You managed that beautifully," Charlotte said, dropping into the chair across from Rosalind's writing table without invitation. "I answered a question," Rosalind said. "You answered it precisely enough that Lady Hargreave will not ask it again in your hearing." Charlotte looked at the account books. "What are you working on?" "The winter fuel accounts. There is a discrepancy in the coal delivery records from September that I want to reconcile before the end of the quarter." "How much of a discrepancy?" £11, 14 shillings. "Possibly an error in the delivery records. Possibly something else." Rosalind looked up. "Are you staying through the week?" "I told Marcus I would stay until Friday, at least." Charlotte studied Rosalind with the frank attention she applied to interesting things. "You do know that Lady Constance's mother has decided the autumn dinner was a courtship event." "I am aware that Lady Constance was invited," Rosalind said. "That is not what I asked." Charlotte rested her chin on her hand. "You have been here 8 months. You have organized this household from a state that Carew privately described as administrative wilderness. You are managing a ducal ward on top of your stated responsibilities, and you have done it all in the same grey dress." Rosalind looked at her. "3 grey dresses," she said. "They are different weights of wool." Charlotte laughed, a sudden, unguarded sound that had no performance in it. "I like you very much," she said. "The feeling," Rosalind said, "is returned." She meant it, which was not something she could have predicted when Charlotte had walked through the door. She returned to the coal delivery records, and Charlotte sat across from her and read a novel she had brought from the library, and they spent 2 hours in the morning room, together, in the particular quiet of women who have found each other's company immediately comprehensible. The coal discrepancy resolved to £11, 6 shillings, a billing error by the merchant, confirmed when Rosalind cross-referenced the delivery notes against the warehouse receipts she had requested 3 weeks earlier, which the merchant had sent reluctantly, and which confirmed that 2 deliveries had been billed at the winter rate in September, before the winter contract had been authorized. She wrote the correction letter herself, and presented it to Marcus for his signature that evening in the library. He read the correction letter and the attached documentation with the same focused attention he brought to everything, and then he looked up and said, "The merchant will push back." "The merchant will receive the delivery receipts as enclosures," Rosalind said. "The dates are unambiguous. He will issue the credit." Marcus signed the letter. He looked at the documentation for a moment longer, before returning it to her. "The September billing date is 11 days before the winter contract was authorized," he said. "I authorized the contract on the 21st. "Yes. Which means he has done this before and expected no one to check the dates." "Almost certainly," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "How many years of accounts have you reviewed?" 3 complete years. The practice appears in the records from 1815 as well." He looked at her with the expression she had learned was his version of emphasis, a slight increase in the density of his attention, as if he were adding weight to something he was already holding carefully. 3 years, he said. "There are more discrepancies in the 1815 accounts. I have a complete list." She set the second document on the desk. "Total correctable amount, £43, 4 shillings. The merchant will argue that some of these are past the correctable window. He is wrong. I have the relevant contract language annotated." Marcus picked up the second document. He read it in silence. When he set it down, his jaw was set in the manner she associated with a decision already made. "Send the list with the first letter," he said, "and include the contract language." She gathered the documents. She was nearly at the library door when he said, without particular inflection, "You have been managing this household for 8 months as though it were your own." She paused with her hand on the doorframe. She did not turn. "That is what the work requires," she said. She felt the truth of it, what it cost to say it out loud, and what it cost to pretend it was only work. She left the library. Thomas threw a pall from the stable clock off the east balcony the following Tuesday, and then demanded to know why it fell, and Marcus explained the principle from the courtyard below, while Rosalind retrieved the pall and brought it back to him in the corridor, and said, "He will take this apart again if it goes back in the clock." She was holding the pall in her bare hand, her gloves in the other. Marcus took the pall from her, his fingers briefly against her palm in the transfer, and neither of them made any acknowledgement of the contact, and both of them were aware of it, like a note played in the wrong key, that is also, somehow, the correct note for the composition. "The music room," Marcus said, the following evening, appearing in the corridor outside it at 9:30, when Rosalind had believed the household settled. "There is something I want to show you." She had not known, until that moment, that he played. He sat down at the instrument and produced 4 bars of a melody that was simple and formally organized, and then he stopped and looked at the music on the stand. It was a handwritten sheet, clearly old, the paper softened with years of handling. "My mother wrote this," he said. "She arranged it from a country air she heard when she was a girl in Wiltshire. I have been trying to complete the second movement for 3 years." He paused. "I cannot find the resolution." Rosalind looked at the music. She could read notation, her father had taught her, and she read the piece now, with the same attention she brought to accounts, tracing the pattern, following where the logic was going, identifying where the structure required its next development. She reached past him and touched the 4th measure. "She modulated here," she said. "She is setting up a return to the home key, but she is preparing it with the subdominant. The resolution goes through there." She traced the progression with her finger above the notation, like this. He played it twice. The second time, something opened in the music that had not been there before, the sense of a path that had found its destination. He sat with his hands still on the keys for a moment. "Yes," he said. It was the quietest word she had ever heard him say. She did not stay. She said goodnight and went back down the corridor to her room, and she stood inside her closed door with her hand against the wood for a long moment, not from distress, but from the specific fullness of a feeling she did not have words sufficient for, the sense of having been useful in a way that was also personal, the dangerous overlap between work and care. She had managed that for 8 months. She could manage it going forward. She was not entirely certain, that night, that she could. The formal review arrived on the 4th of November in the form of Lord Hargreaves' request, conveyed through the Duke's secretary, that a meeting be convened between the Duke, Lord Hargreave, his associate Mr. Fenwick, and the relevant household principals, to discuss the question of Thomas's wardship arrangement and its suitability. Lord Hargreave had been specific. He believed the current arrangement was informal to the point of impropriety and required formal review before winter. Marcus received this request in the library, with Carew present, and a particular quality of stillness that Rosalind, who was also present, because he had asked her to be, recognized as the surface beneath which a decision had already been made and was simply waiting for the correct moment to be stated. "Hargreave is acting as a family representative," Carew said. "He has some standing to request a formal review. It would not be advisable to refuse the meeting." "I have no intention of refusing the meeting," Marcus said. He looked at Rosalind. "I want the full documentation of Thomas's care, the schedule, the accounts, the quarterly reports, everything you have produced since July." "I can have it prepared by Thursday," she said. "I would like it by Wednesday evening," he said, "and I would like you present at the meeting." Carew looked at Rosalind with the expression she had come to recognize as his form of approval, a slight relaxing of the lines around his eyes, a quality of quiet satisfaction that he expressed through stillness rather than speech. He was 61, with white hair and the practiced composure of a man who had seen the inside of many difficult rooms and had learned that useful calm is the most persuasive thing in any of them. "I will confirm the arrangement with Hargreaves' secretary," he said. She had the documentation prepared by Tuesday evening. It comprised 11 pages, Thomas's daily schedule and its rationale, the household account allocation for his care, itemized, a record of his health and the actions taken in response to the fever he had run in August, the modifications made to the East Nursery and their cost, a summary of his developmental progress organized by month, which was not something she had been asked to produce, but which she had been noting since his arrival, because she had known, with the particular foresight of someone who has managed situations before they become crises, that someone would eventually ask. She brought the documentation to Marcus on Tuesday evening. He read it at his desk while she stood across from him, and when he finished, he set it down and was quiet for a moment. "The August fever," he said. "You consulted Dr. Hartley without my authorization." You were at the Northern Estate, she said. The fever required attention within 6 hours. I made the decision and documented it. The consultation cost £2.10, charged to the household medical account. A pause. If that was incorrect, I am prepared to defend the decision. It was correct, Marcus said. He said it simply, without qualification. I am noting it because Hargreave will note it, and I want us both to have the same answer. He closed the documentation. Wednesday evening, Miss Vane. Lord Hargreave arrived with Mr. Fenwick and a third man, a solicitor named Drayton, whose presence made it clear that this was not a conversation, but a review. They arranged themselves on one side of the library table. Marcus sat at the head. Carew sat to his left. Rosalind sat at the table's right side, with her 11 pages of documentation in front of her, and she pressed both hands flat against the documents for a moment, before she folded them in her lap and looked across the table. She was wearing the dark green dress. She had pressed it the previous evening, until the cuffs were as good as they could be. Drayton opened by saying that the concern of the family interested parties was the informality of the current wardship arrangement, the absence of a formal guardian designation in law, and the question of whether the current household management structure adequately served the interests of a child who was heir to certain voluntary family connections. Rosalind let him finish. Then she said, "May I present the documentation of the care arrangement to date?" And without waiting for Drayton to answer, she placed the first page on the table and began. She did not argue, and she did not plead. She presented. She worked through the schedule, the accounts, the health record, the developmental notes, in the measured pace of someone who has organized the material so that each page answers the question the previous page has raised. She had written the documentation to be read exactly as she was reading it now, in sequence, building to the single fact that made the entire arrangement legible. Thomas was a child who had arrived in grief and instability, and had, in 4 months, become a child who slept regularly, ate well, asked questions with increasing confidence, and threw chess pieces off balconies in the spirit of scientific inquiry. The ward of the dukedom was flourishing. The documentation said so, and the documentation was specific, and it contained actual numbers, and actual dates, and actual measurements of actual conditions. When she finished, there was a silence in the room of approximately 8 seconds. Drayton was looking at the pages. Mr. Fenwick was looking at Drayton. Lord Hargreave was looking at Rosalind with an expression that was not what he had brought into the room. It was a more complicated expression, the expression of a man who has prepared for a different kind of conversation and has found the one he arrived at is not available. "The arrangement is thorough," Drayton said, finally. He said it carefully, as though the thoroughness had surprised him, and he was not entirely comfortable with the surprise. "The question of legal formalization remains," Hargreave said. "Carew has prepared the formal guardianship documents," Marcus said. He said it without preamble, without the quality of a man producing a surprise. He said it as someone states a thing that has been arranged. "I will sign them this week. Thomas is my ward by legal designation, which formalizes what has been the practical reality since July." He looked at Hargreave. "If you have a concern about the care arrangement specifically, I invite you to name it." Hargreave looked at the documentation. He looked at Rosalind. He said, slowly, the words of a man trying something on, "The arrangement is unusual." "The circumstances were unusual," Marcus said. "Miss Vane managed them." There was a pause that lasted longer than a social pause. Hargreave set the documentation down. He smoothed the edge of the first page with one finger, which was a small gesture and a specific one, the gesture of a man acknowledging something he did not intend to acknowledge. "The child appears well," he said. He said it without warmth but also without contempt, and it was not a concession, and it was also not nothing. The meeting closed 40 minutes later. Carew walked Drayton and Fenwick to the door. Lord Hargreave paused in the library doorway, where Marcus had not moved from his position at the head of the table, and he looked at the room for a moment with the expression of a man revising a calculation. "The documentation is thorough," he said. He said it to the room, not specifically to Rosalind, which was the closest he had available to saying it to her. He left. She gathered the documentation into its neat stack, 11 pages in order, and her hands were steady. She did not allow herself to feel anything fully until she was alone. Charlotte was waiting in the morning room with 2 cups of tea and a direct look. How did it go? The documentation was sufficient, Rosalind said. She sat down. She picked up the tea. She pressed her hand once against the warm side of the cup and held it there for a moment. Lord Hargreave called it thorough. Coming from Hargreave, Charlotte said, thorough is practically a standing ovation. Rosalind looked at her. Yes, she said. I think it rather is. The winter dinner was to be the largest event at Ashwick Park in 4 years. 41 guests, a full formal supper, a musicale afterward. Rosalind had been planning it since September. The invitations had gone out under the Duke's name in October, and the RSVPs had come back by the 1st of November, and she had built the logistical structure in her account books in the same way she built everything, by identifying the actual work, breaking it into its components, and addressing each component in the correct order before the incorrect order made it impossible. By the 1st of December, 17 tasks were complete, and 6 were in progress. On the 4th of December, the wine merchant's delivery arrived short by 12 bottles, which was not a crisis, but required an immediate correction. On the 6th, the musicale's hired performer sent word that she was unwell and could not come. Rosalind received this information at 7 in the morning and sat with it for approximately 40 seconds. Then she went to find Marcus. He was in the library, as he was most mornings at this hour, with the estate correspondence. He looked up when she entered. She said, "The musicale performer is indisposed. The engagement cannot be honoured." She paused. "I need to know how you wish to address the programme." He looked at her for a moment. "You play," he said. It was not a question. He had heard her. She was aware. On the evening she had helped him with his mother's composition, and on at least 2 subsequent evenings when she had worked through the second movement at the music room piano after dinner, not knowing he was in the corridor. She had heard his footsteps stop outside the closed door twice, and she had not altered her playing, and the footsteps had not moved until she had finished. She had not counted on that being seen. She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like recognition. "I do not have the training for a formal musicale," she said. "You have the ability," he said. He said it with the precision of a man who has listened through a closed door on 3 evenings and knows exactly what he has heard. "The question is whether you are willing." She thought about it. She thought about it the way she thought about everything, completely, without hurrying toward the answer she was afraid of. She thought about the 41 guests, and the dining room, and the program that had been arranged, and what it would cost, and what it might mean. "I will play 2 pieces," she said. "The first will be straightforward, something the room knows. The second will be your mother's composition. The second movement is finished now." He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had the quality she had heard once before, in the music room, when she had traced the modulation with her finger above the notation. "Yes," he said, "just that." The evening of the winter dinner, Rosalind wore the dark green dress. She had let out the cuffs and retrimmed them with a narrow velvet ribbon that Charlotte had produced from somewhere with the cheerful efficiency of a person who has anticipated this moment. The dress was not what Lady Constance wore. Ivory again, a different ivory, deliberately chosen, and it was not what the other women wore. And Rosalind was aware of this and wore it anyway, because it was what she had, and what she had was sufficient. She managed the dinner from inside the room this time, because Charlotte had organised 2 of the footmen and the cook's assistant into a service chain that functioned without Rosalind's direct supervision, which Charlotte had arranged deliberately and had told Rosalind about, with the expression of someone springing a pleasant surprise. "You managed the last dinner from the doorway," Charlotte said. "You are a guest tonight, or near enough." She was not a guest. She sat at the furthest seat from the head, near the service door, and ate quietly, and watched the room with the attention she always brought to rooms. She watched Marcus at the head of the table, where he was managing 41 people with the contained precision that characterized everything he did, and she watched him pause at one point in the fourth course and look down the table toward her, with the measuring attention that was not like how he looked at anything else. She looked back at him steadily. She held his gaze for 2 seconds, which was not improper and was also not nothing, and then she returned to the conversation on her left. After dinner, the guests moved to the drawing room, which had been arranged for the musicale. Rosalind sat at the piano at the far end of the room, with the particular composure of someone who has already decided. She played the first piece, a Haydn sonata she had known since childhood, and the room listened with the polite attention of guests who have arrived for entertainment and have received it. It was correct and clean, and asked nothing of the room. Then she played the second piece. It began simply, the country air, as the elder Duchess had arranged it, 4 bars of a melody that was both ordinary and clear, the kind of music that is not performed but remembered. Then the second movement that she and Marcus had finished together, the modulation through the subdominant, the path returning to the home key. The room changed its quality of listening without knowing it had changed. People who had been attending to their neighbours turned toward the piano. The piece had the specific quality of music that tells the truth about something, not dramatically, not overwhelmingly, but with the steady authority of something that is simply correct. When it ended, the room was quiet for 4 seconds. Then it was not. The applause was genuine, not the performed applause of an audience fulfilling an obligation, but the sound of people who have been surprised into feeling something they had not prepared for. Lady Constance was sitting 7 feet from the piano. She looked at Rosalind with an expression that was complex and complicated, and ultimately arrived at something that was not contempt, and was not warmth but was real recognition. The expression of a woman who has competed for something and understood, in the same moment, the nature of what she was competing with. She turned to the woman beside her and said something quiet. She did not look unkind. She looked like someone recalculating. Lord Hargreave, seated at the back of the room, was looking at the piano with the expression Rosalind had last seen him wear in the library, when he had smoothed the edge of the documentation page, a man revising a calculation he had believed was complete. Marcus stood beside the fireplace, 12 feet from the piano, and he did not move for the duration of the applause, and he did not look at the room. He looked at Rosalind. Then he crossed the room. He crossed it in full view of 41 people, unhurriedly, with the deliberate pace of a man who has decided something and intends the room to understand that the decision is made. He stopped in front of Rosalind, who had risen from the piano bench. He took her hand, her bare right hand, which she had removed the glove from to play, and he kissed it. Not briefly, deliberately, with the attention of a man who is aware that 41 people are watching and has chosen to be here anyway, has chosen that she should have witnesses for this, because she has spent too long being invisible in rooms full of people, and he is done with that. The room did not erupt immediately. There was a suspended moment, the particular quality of a room that has understood something before it has articulated it. Charlotte Devereux, standing to Rosalind's left, looked at Marcus with the expression of someone who has been waiting for a conclusion and has finally arrived at it. Carew, near the door, was looking at his shoes with a small and private satisfaction. Rosalind looked at Marcus. She was aware of 41 people. She was aware of Lady Constance's recalculating expression and Lord Hargreave's revised arithmetic, and Charlotte's quiet delight, and Carew's shoes. She was aware of 8 months of morning accounts and coal delivery records, and the music room at 9:30, and Thomas asleep in the East Nursery with the routine she had built for him, and her father's voice teaching her to read notation, and 4 years at a writing table in York, managing creditors who had never known her name. She was not going to step aside for anyone. She never had been. "Your Grace," she said quietly. "Miss Vane," he said, with the same gravity, and she heard in his voice the specific quality that she had heard once before, in the music room, at the resolution of his mother's composition. He said nothing else in the drawing room. He did not need to. The room had already understood. He came to find her the following morning in the morning room, which was where she was, because she was reviewing the post-dinner accounts with a cup of tea, and the particular composure of someone who has had an event and has returned to the work, because the work is also a form of honesty. He closed the door behind him. He stood across the room from her for a moment, and then he sat down in the chair across from her writing table, the chair Charlotte had claimed 2 months ago, and he looked at her with the complete attention he brought to things he intended to address precisely. "I would like to speak to you," he said. "You are speaking to me," she said. A pause that contained something warmer than his usual pauses. "I have been thinking," he said, "about how to say this in a way that is accurate." She set down her pen. She waited. "Not because it is convenient," he said, "or because it is appropriate by any measure the current society would apply, or because it fits the requirements my position imposes, but because you have been managing the structure of this household, and the care of a child who needed it, and the accounts of my estate for 8 months, with a precision and a completeness that I have not found in any other person in my life since my mother died. And because when you played her composition last evening, I understood something about it that I had not understood in 3 years of trying." He paused. "And because when you are in a room, the room is more ordered than it was before you entered it. And when you are not in it, I notice." Rosalind looked at him. She thought about it. She thought about it completely, with the same steady attention she brought to everything, the accounts and the contracts and the coal delivery dates and the music. She thought about Thomas at the top of the staircase with the chess piece. She thought about the music room at 9:30 and the library at midnight, and the pause in the 4th course of the autumn dinner, when he had looked down the table and found her. She thought about what it would mean to build something deliberately, with someone who had chosen her, with his eyes open, knowing what she was and what she was not. "Yes," she said. Not immediately, she had thought about it, but simply and directly, and with the full weight of a woman who does not say things she does not mean. He looked at her with the expression she had seen once before, the fractional opening. The door moved by a change in air pressure, and then, because he was Marcus Vellantry, and he was aware of what it meant to do a thing correctly, he stood up, and he went down on one knee, there in the morning room, with the account books on the table, and the tea going cold, and he took her hand, and looked up at her. "Miss Vane," he said, "will you allow me the considerable privilege?" "I believe I already said yes," she said. "I wanted the form of it to be correct," he said. She looked down at him for a moment, with the particular expression of someone who has found, after a long time, that the thing she did not count on has arrived anyway. "Get up," she said, not unkindly. "There is coal delivery documentation to finish." He got up. He was, she noticed for the first time, smiling, the real version, the one he kept behind the precision and the containment, the one that changed his face entirely. She looked at it for a moment, and then she picked up her pen. "The button on your tailcoat," she said. "It has been undone since yesterday morning." He looked down at it. He fastened the button. He said, "You have known since yesterday morning." "Since the autumn dinner," she said. "In October, you came in from the East Garden." He looked at her with an expression that was beyond the fractional opening now. The whole door moved on its hinges. "Miss Vane," he said, "I believe I have been understood for some time." "You have," she said. "It is not a complaint." They were married in February, which was again the wrong month for anything in the north of England, and was also the month his mother had preferred for important occasions, which Carew mentioned when handling the arrangements, and Marcus did not correct. The ceremony was small by the standards of the dukedom, which meant 40 people instead of 200. and Carew was there with the particular expression of a man watching something he arranged come to its correct conclusion. And Charlotte Devereux was there, in a yellow dress, that was entirely wrong for February, and entirely right for Charlotte. And Thomas was there in a small suit, that he had already partially disassembled by the time the service began, and he sat between Marcus and Rosalind during the service, with the settled confidence of a child who knows where his place is. Lord Hargreave attended. He sat in the third row, and he did not make any speech, and he did not offer any objection, and at the end of the service, he shook Marcus's hand, and looked at Rosalind, with the expression she had seen him wear in the library, and he said, the documentation was thorough, it was the closest he had to well done, and she accepted it, in the spirit in which it was meant. Lady Constance Farewell was not present. She had accepted an offer from a baronet in Derbyshire in January, which was, by all accounts, a satisfactory match, and she was not destroyed, and not unhappy, and was simply, as Rosalind had predicted to herself, without articulating it, elsewhere. The life they built had the quality of things constructed with accurate materials. It was solid and specific, and occasionally subject to revision when new information arrived, which it frequently did. Marcus continued to manage the northern estate and the dukedom's wider holdings, and Rosalind continued to manage Ashwick Park and its accounts, which was now her official and documented responsibility, because Marcus had drawn up a formal household superintendent agreement in March that named her specifically and described her responsibilities with the particularity that Carew had praised and that the other neighbouring estates had begun, quietly, to inquire about. By the following January, she had produced an annotated account structure, the categorization framework she had developed for Ashwick Park, with the clause language for the supplier contracts and the creditor documentation methodology that Carew had distributed, at his own initiative, to 3 neighbouring estates whose managers had asked how the Ashwick Park accounts had achieved the clarity they had. By the end of the year, 2 of those estates had adopted her methodology in full, the third had adopted it in part, and sent a letter of appreciation that she filed in the household records without ceremony. Thomas grew. He grew in the particular direction of a child who has been given routine and curiosity in equal measure. He threw fewer things off balconies and asked more questions about why they fell, and Marcus explained the principles with the patience of a man who has found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he is good at this. He was 9 when he stopped being the only child in the East Nursery. Their son was born in the second winter of the marriage, in December, when the frost was at the windows and the fire was built up in the nursery, and Rosalind had managed the preparations for the birth with the same organised attention she brought to everything, which Marcus had observed and said nothing about, except to ensure that Dr. Hartley arrived 4 days early, because he had read her notes and done his own arithmetic, and was not going to leave the timing to chance. They named him Edward, after Carew, who had looked at this information with the quiet satisfaction of a man who does not make a great deal of noise about the things that matter to him. Edward secured the succession, which was the practical matter, and grew into a child who had his father's precise attention and his mother's habit of sitting with account books and making careful marks in the margins, which Rosalind observed at age 4 with a feeling she did not attempt to describe, only to acknowledge, pressing her hand briefly against the doorframe of the morning room, while Edward sat at the small table she had placed there for him, very serious over a ledger with his letters carefully practiced down the columns. On the morning of their 5th wedding anniversary, Marcus came to find her in the morning room, which was where she always was, because that was where the accounts were, and the accounts were the work, and the work was also, by now, entirely inseparable from the life. He stood in the doorway and looked at her the way he had looked at her in the autumn dinner, across the length of the table, except that now she was not at the far end, and he was not performing obligation. He was simply in the doorway of the room that held the person who kept the house standing, watching her. She knew he was there. She had known since he stopped in the corridor. She did not look up immediately. She made the final notation in the quarterly account, the Eastern Tenant Farms, the corrected fuel figures, the wool contract renewal, and then she set down the pen and looked at him. "The accounts balance," she said. "They always do," he said. She rose. He was still in the doorway, and she crossed the room to him, and he took both her hands and held them in the way he had learned to hold things he valued, carefully, with the full weight of his attention, without performance. Outside the morning room window, the east garden was bare and cold in the February light, and upstairs Thomas was explaining to Edward why the chess piece falls faster than a feather, which was incorrect in one important particular, but showed the right instinct. And somewhere in the corridor, a small pair of boot heels was audible, running, and Rosalind turned her head toward the sound with the composed attention of a woman who knows exactly where everyone is. Marcus looked at her. She looked back. The house was standing. It had been standing for 5 years by her hand and his, and it would stand by the same arrangement for years to come, documented and ordered and warm, and there was nothing more to say about it, and nothing left unfinished, and that was enough.